Welcome back to the deep dive. Today is Sunday, February 15th, 2026. And I want to start today by asking you to do something a little uncomfortable. I want you to try and visualize a number.
Okay, I'm braced. What's the number?
$1 trillion.
Oh,
Yeah.
that is a number that the human brain isn't really built to comprehend.
It really isn't. It's a stack of $1,000 bills that would literally reach into space. But the thing is, this isn't just some abstract number on a spreadsheet.
Right.
It's a wall. A $1 trillion wall that is, right now, keeping a continent of 1.4 billion people in what you can only describe as a financial chokehold.
Yeah.
We are talking, of course, about the African debt crisis.
Right. And, usually when this topic comes up in the news cycle, it's this incredibly depressing, predictable story.
Always.
It's always another country defaults, another IMF bailout, another round of austerity measures.
Exactly. It's a story that feels like despair. But before you think this is just going to be another sad economics lesson, I need you to just stop. Because the deep dive we are doing today, it is not about despair.
No, it's the opposite.
It's about a plan. A plan so audacious, so massive in scale, and frankly so creative in its technical details that it's being compared to the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe after the Second World War.
It's a really fascinating piece of thinking. We are diving into a source today that basically argues we have been looking at this entire problem completely wrong for the last 50 years.
The source is a blog post. It's titled The African Sovereign Reset. And it was just published yesterday, Valentine's Day 2026, on a blog called Barakface.
Which is, I have to admit, a very memorable name for a blog.
It is. The author is a man named Paramendra Bhagat. And when you look at the sidebar on his blog, you realize pretty quickly this is not your typical buttoned-up economist from Wall Street or the IMF.
Not at all. This isn't someone who spent their whole life in one narrow field.
No. He writes about agentic AI. In fact, he has a post called Agentic AI set to explode in 2026. He writes novels, like one called The Country of Geniuses. He writes about global politics. So he's coming at this problem from this very different angle.
Right. He's blending high finance with what feels like a futurist's outlook.
And that multidisciplinary background is actually, I think, the key to understanding the proposal he's making here.
I agree completely. Because he's not just, moving numbers around on a balance sheet to make the math work for the next fiscal quarter. He's proposing a total system redesign. He's looking at the fundamental architecture of the global economy and saying, this code is buggy. It's time for a rewrite.
Let's just get to the core premise right away. Bhagat writes, and I'm quoting directly here, Africa's debt problem must be reframed as a system design failure, not a budgeting failure.
And that one sentence, that is a profound shift in perspective.
How so?
Well, think about the usual narrative. When a country, let's say Ghana or Zambia, can't pay its debts, the immediate assumption in the West is,
You were irresponsible.
You were irresponsible. Right. You spend too much. You managed your budget poorly. The blame is placed squarely on the borrower.
Like a person who maxed out their credit cards on things they didn't need.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what this source, what Bhagat is arguing, is that the entire financial plumbing that connects Africa to the rest of the world, it's broken by design. It was never actually intended to allow these economies to grow and catch up.
It was built for something else.
It was built to facilitate resource extraction and ensure interest payments keep flowing. So the system design failure argument says it doesn't matter how disciplined your budget is. If the game itself is rigged against you, you are going to lose.
So our mission for today's deep dive is to unpack his proposal for this African Sovereign Reset, or ASR. And I want to be really clear. This isn't just, hey, could you please forgive a few $1 billion?
No, this is much bigger.
This is a 7-step roadmap to completely wipe the slate clean, convert all that debt into equity, and we are going to spend a lot of time explaining what that actually means, because it's the heart of the whole idea, and maybe even launch a new continent-wide currency.
And we have to look at the geopolitical context, what's happening right now in early 2026. There's this news in the source's sidebar about Italy's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, who is making some very surprising moves on Africa.
Right. It creates this strange moment where the political stars might actually be aligning for something this radical to be possible.
It's a fascinating convergence.
Okay, let's get into it. We have to start with the diagnosis of the problem, Section 1. Why is the current way of doing things? Why is it dead on arrival? Why can't we just keep restructuring?
To really get why the proposed solution is so different, you have to first understand the trap. As the source says, right now, Africa's total external public debt is over $1 trillion.
The big number.
The big number. But the complexity isn't just the amount, it's who holds that debt.
Right, because it's not like you can just call one bank manager and ask for a better deal. The source breaks it down into three main buckets. Let's walk through them because each one has a totally different motivation. First up, you've got the multilateral institutions.
Okay, so that's your International Monetary Fund, your World Bank. These are the traditional lenders of last resort. They tend to lend at lower interest rates, but, and it's big but, they come with very heavy conditions attached. Austerity. Structural adjustment. They're sort of the strict parents of the global financial system.
Okay, bucket number two, the bilateral lenders.
These are direct government-to-government loans. And the source specifically calls out China here, which is critical. Over the past 20 years, China's become the biggest single bilateral lender on the continent, financing huge infrastructure projects, roads, dams, ports, railways.
Okay, and then there's the third bucket, and this is the one that I think has made everything so much more complicated over the last decade or so, the private bondholders.
This is Wall Street,
Yeah.
the City of London, private investment funds. This is where it gets really, really messy.
Why messy?
Because in the old days, say 30 or 40 years ago, most of a country's debt was owed to other governments or the World Bank. So if the U.S. had lent money to, say, Kenya, the U.S. president could, in theory, just get on the phone and say, you know what, for geopolitical reasons, we're writing it off. Don't worry about it.
A relatively simple fix.
It was politically difficult, but mechanically simple. But now, so much of that debt has been chopped up, packaged into bonds, and sold on the open market.
So who owns it?
It could be anyone. A pension fund in California that needs to pay its retirees, a hedge fund in London looking for high yield, an insurance company in Frankfurt. You can't just call a customer service hotline for the global bond market and ask for forgiveness. You're dealing with thousands of anonymous contract holders whose only legal obligation is to their own investors.
And their only goal is to get their coupon payment.
That's it. And the source argues that the current models for dealing with this three-headed monster, things like the Paris Club for Government Debt or the G20's Common Framework, they're total failures.
Why have they failed so badly?
Bagat describes them as endless restructurings that just lead to chronic IMF programs and serial defaults.
Oh.
Let's walk through the cycle. It's a trap.
Okay.
So your country has too much debt. You can't make the payments. You go to the IMF for a bailout.
The strict parents.
The strict parents. They say, okay, we'll give you a loan so you can pay the interest on your old loans. But you have to cut your budget. You have to fire government workers, cut fuel subsidies, reduce spending on education and health care.
Which obviously hurts your economy.
It strangles your economy, so your economy shrinks. And because your economy has shrunk, your government's tax revenues go down. Now you have even less money to pay the debt next year.
So you need another bailout.
So you need another bailout. It's a death spiral. You are literally starving the patient to pay for the medicine that's killing them. It makes no sense.
And while this financial death spiral is happening, there's another clock ticking in the background. A much bigger, more dangerous clock.
The demographic clock.
This is the part of the article that, frankly, it just floored me. It's the why this matters right now argument.
This is what creates the urgency. The source points out that Africa's median age is just 19.
19.
Half the entire population is a teenager or younger. I mean, just pause and think about that.
Compare that to Europe or Japan.
In Europe, the median age is over 40. In Japan, it's closer to 50. They're aging. They're shrinking. Africa is exploding with youth. The source says that by 2050, just over 2 decades from now, 1 in every 4 human beings on this planet will be African.
1 in 4. That is a staggering statistic to try and get your head around.
It is. And now think about what that means if you're an African finance minister. You have hundreds of millions of young people who are about to enter the workforce.
They all need schools.
They need education. They need vocational training. They need reliable electricity. They need roads to get goods to market. They need jobs. A lot of jobs.
Yeah, but all the money that could be paying for that is flying out of the country to pay interest to bondholders in New York and London.
Precisely. The source makes the direct link. If your government is spending 30, 40, sometimes 50% of its entire revenue just servicing old debt, what are you not spending that money on?
Everything.
You're not building the universities. You're not fixing the power grid. You're not investing in the agricultural tech that would make you food secure.
So you are systematically creating a generation of young people who are undereducated and underemployed, not because they lack talent or ambition, but because the state itself is completely paralyzed by debt service.
And the source is very explicit about the consequences of this. This isn't just an economic problem. If you ignore this demographic time bomb,
What happens?
you get massive youth unemployment crises. You get enormous migration pressures on Europe. Millions of young men and women with no future at home who will risk everything to get across the Mediterranean. And you get political instability.
Coups, civil unrest, extremism.
All of it. Because a large population of unemployed, hopeless young men is the perfect fuel for any kind of political violence.
So keeping the status quo isn't just, a bit unfair. It's actively dangerous for global stability. It's a ticking bomb.
That's a ticking bomb.
Yeah.
Exactly. Which brings us to the core of the proposal, the first principle of the reset.
Section 2. The twist. Okay, so the problem is massive. The stakes are existential. What's the first step of the solution?
The source proposes a global African debt summit. The location is key. Addis Ababa, the headquarters of the African Union.
So it's hosted by Africa for Africa.
Symbolically, that's hugely important. And everyone is invited to the table. The G20 nations, the IMF, the World Bank, China, the big sovereign wealth funds, and crucially, the private bondholders from Wall Street and London.
And what's the goal of this summit? What are they trying to achieve?
The stated goal is a coordinated 50 to 100% debt cancellation for all low-income African countries.
Whoa, okay, stop right
I
there.
knew that would get your attention.
Because if you're a listener and maybe you have a pension fund or a 401k that invests in an emerging markets bond ETF, you just had a small heart attack.
You're thinking, wait a minute. You want to just erase my investment? That's default. That's theft.
Exactly. That sounds like the definition of a sovereign default. Sorry, we're not paying you back. The markets would panic. No one would ever lend to an African country again for decades.
And that is the traditional fear. That is the argument that has been used forever to stop any meaningful debt relief. But here is the critical part. This is the twist.
Okay.
The source says creditors don't walk away empty-handed. This is not about just tearing up the contract.
All right, explain the twist. How do you cancel the debt without the creditors losing everything?
The best way to understand it is through an analogy from the corporate world. It's the difference between a Chapter 7 bankruptcy and a Chapter 11 reorganization. And we really need to get this because it's the engine of the whole proposal.
Okay, break it down for us. Let's start with Chapter 7. What's that?
Chapter 7 is liquidation. The company is dead. Let's say it's a big retail chain that goes bust. In Chapter 7, you sell everything off for parts. You sell the store shelves, you liquidate the inventory for pennies on the dollar, you pay the creditors whatever scraps were left over, and everyone goes home disappointed. The company ceases to exist.
And that's what a typical sovereign default feels like.
Yes, it's scorched earth, burned bridges, lost trust, a total mess.
Okay, so then what's Chapter 11?
Chapter 11 is reorganization. In Chapter 11, the court and the creditors look at the company and say, wait a minute, this company actually has a good underlying business. It has valuable assets. It has loyal customers. It's just being choked to death by too much debt on its balance sheet.
So it's fundamentally viable, just over-leveraged?
Precisely. So the court says, we're not going to liquidate it. Instead, you creditors, you guys who are owed all this money, you are going to trade your debt for stock in the reorganized company.
So the lenders become the owners?
Exactly. You convert your debt claim into an equity stake.
Huh.
And here's the magic. If the company, now freed from its crushing interest payments, turns around and becomes successful, that stock could become incredibly valuable.
So the creditors might actually end up making more money in the long run than if they'd just foreclosed.
It happens all the time. They bet on the future success of the company rather than fighting over the scraps of its past failure.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, Vagot is proposing that we treat the entire continent of Africa like a massive company going through a Chapter 11 reorganization.
That is exactly it. He's proposing to take all that debt, those bonds, those loans,
Yeah.
and convert them into what he calls long-term equity-linked development instruments.
Okay, that is a mouthful of financial jargon. Long-term equity-linked development instruments. Let's unpack that word by word. What does that actually look like in the real world?
It looks like the African Future Fund. This is Section 3. This is the engine that makes the whole reset work.
The African Future Fund, the
Wow.
AFF.
Imagine a gigantic, continent-wide sovereign wealth fund. The source suggests a capitalization target of $2 to $3 trillion over 20 years.
That is That's an incredible amount of money. That's bigger than the famous Norwegian sovereign wealth fund.
It has to be.
Yeah.
The scale of the need is massive. The scale of the opportunity is massive. The idea is, instead of you, the creditor, holding a bond from, say, Kenya, that's supposed to pay you 8% interest next year, which Kenya can't really afford.
Right.
You trade that bond in, and in exchange, you get a share, an equity stake in this new African Future Fund.
Okay, so I'm a pension fund manager in Ohio. I hand over my portfolio of Zambian and Ghanaian bonds, and in return, I get a certificate that says I own a piece of the AFF. What does this fund actually do with my capital?
The fund's mandate is to invest in the core infrastructure that creates real, long-term economic growth, the things that Africa has been starved of for decades.
The source lists some specific sectors.
Yes, and they're very deliberate choices. Pan-African energy grids and railways, AI infrastructure, climate-resilient water systems, and smart agriculture. And, of course, education and human capital.
Let's dig into a couple of those. Why a Pan-African railway, for instance?
Because right now, intra-African trade is incredibly low. It is often cheaper and faster to ship a container from Lagos, Nigeria to Shanghai, China, than it is to ship it from Lagos to Nairobi, Kenya.
That's insane.
It's a legacy of colonial infrastructure, which was all designed to get raw materials out of the continent to the ports, not to connect African economies to each other. If you build a modern high-speed rail network connecting, say, the Atlantic coast in Senegal to the Indian Ocean coast in Djibouti, you unleash a torrent of internal trade. Economies of scale kick in, industries develop.
It creates a true continental market.
A single market of 1.4 billion people. And what about the AI infrastructure?
Yeah, that one stood out to me, especially given the author's background.
Right. Bagat clearly believes that AI is the next industrial revolution on par with steam or electricity. And if Africa gets left behind on this wave, the gap between it and the rest of the world will become a chasm.
But if they can leapfrog...
If they can build the data centers, lay the fiber optic cables, and train their massive young population in data science, they can become a global hub for digital services, for AI development. It's a huge potential advantage.
Okay, so the fund is building all this incredible future-focused stuff. That's great for Africa. But let's go back to our pension fund manager in Ohio. He traded in his bonds. How does he get a return on his investment? How does he get paid?
This is another key innovation. The source says creditors would receive revenue-sharing notes with a long-term horizon, maybe 25 to 40 years,
Sure.
and their payout is linked to two things.
Okay.
First, they are GDP-linked.
GDP link. So if Africa's overall economy grows, the investors in the fund make more money?
Yes, and if for some reason the economy stagnates or shrinks, they earn less.
That completely changes the psychology of the relationship.
It's a revolution in incentives. Right now, the incentive for a bondholder in London is just to get his payment on time, in full. He frankly doesn't care if the government has to cut the school lunch budget to make that payment. It's a predatory extractive relationship.
But under this new model...
Under this new model, that investor in London needs the African economy to boom. He is actively rooting for that new railway to be full of cargo. He's cheering for a good harvest from the smart agriculture projects, because his own financial return is mathematically tied to the success of the continent.
It aligns the incentives of the lender and the borrower for the first time in history.
For the first time. The other payout mechanism mentioned is infrastructure toll dividends.
So direct revenue from the projects.
Exactly. If that new energy grid sells electricity, or that railway charges freight fees, a portion of that revenue flows directly back to the fund and then out as dividends to the investors. It transforms dead debt, which is just paying for money that was spent long ago, into live equity, which is an investment in future growth.
I love that framing, converting dead debt to live equity. But let's get practical for a moment. You can't just swap pieces of paper and expect a railroad to appear.
Right.
You need actual, real cash, liquidity, to pay the engineers to buy the steel. Where does the initial seed money come from to get this whole fund off the ground?
An excellent question.
Wow.
And that brings us to Section 4. Financing the reset. This is where we get into the deep plumbing of the global financial system. The source calls for a massive expansion and reallocation of SDRs.
Oh boy, SDRs, special drawing rights. We've talked about these on the show before, and I feel like it's the moment when everyone's eyes glaze over.
It can be a bit abstract, I admit.
So we need to make this crystal clear. Give us the explain like I'm five version of what an SDR is.
Okay. The simplest way to think about it is this. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, is like the central bank for all the world's central banks. And SDRs are basically the IMF's own special currency. They're not cash you can, go spend at the grocery store. They are a special type of reserve asset. A country's central bank can hold SDRs, and if they need to, they can easily exchange them for usable hard currencies like US dollars, euros, or Japanese yen.
So it's almost like a universal gift card for governments.
That is a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
It's a gift card from the world's financial system that never expires. Now, here's the key part. The IMF can just create new SDRs. They can essentially print them out of thin air. They did exactly this in 2021 during the COVID pandemic to help inject liquidity into the global economy.
So the proposal here is just do that again, but on a bigger scale.
A much bigger scale. The source proposes issuing $1 to $2 trillion worth of new SDRs.
Wow, that is a lot of gift cards.
It's a huge number. But there's a fundamental problem with how SDRs are normally distributed.
What's that?
They're allocated based on a country's quota in the IMF, which is basically a measure of how big and rich your economy is. So when the IMF creates new SDRs, the United States gets the biggest share. The big European countries get a ton, China gets a lot.
And African countries.
They get the smallest slice of the pie. It's a system where the countries that need the help the least get the most.
It's like giving a food bank voucher to a billionaire.
Exactly.
Yeah,
It makes no sense. So the source proposes a massive reallocation. The idea is that the rich countries, the G7 for example, would agree to take their huge new allocations of SDRs and immediately transfer them to capitalize the African Future Fund.
So the U.S. Treasury gets its SDR allocation from the IMF, and instead of just sitting on it, they transfer it directly to this new African investment vehicle.
Precisely. It's essentially a way to use the existing global financial architecture to execute a massive coordinated wealth transfer to fund this new beginning for Africa.
Okay, but I can hear the critics howling already. Why on earth would the U.S. taxpayer agree to that? Why would Europe just give away billions in reserve assets? This sounds like pure charity, and we know that powerful nations don't operate on charity, they operate on self-interest.
A completely fair and predictable critique. But the source anticipates this and brings in a very powerful counter-argument to frame it not as charity but as justice. Step 4. The climate justice offset mechanism.
Ah, the climate angle. This is clever.
It's very clever. The core data point here is stark and morally unarguable. The entire continent of Africa is responsible for less than 4% of cumulative global carbon emissions.
Less than 4%.
Less than 4%. And yet, who is suffering the most from the consequences of climate change? It's Africa. Catastrophic droughts in the Horn of Africa, devastating floods in Nigeria, desertification in the Sahel. They're on the front lines of a crisis they did almost nothing to create.
So the argument becomes that the high-emission nations, the U.S., China, Europe, the historic industrial powers, we owe a climate debt to Africa.
Yes. And this proposal reframes the whole transaction, the debt relief and the SDR transfer. It's not forgiveness, which implies the borrower did something wrong. It's not aid, which sounds like a handout.
It's a payment.
It's climate reparations. It's an offset. The argument to the American or European taxpayer becomes, quote, we broke their climate. The resulting instability is a threat to us. So we are going to help fix their balance sheet as a down payment on fixing the planet.
It's a trade. We messed up the sky, so we'll help you fix your books.
It's a powerful moral argument wrapped in a pragmatic financial transaction. And in the world of geopolitics, that's often the only way you can get big moral ideas to actually happen. You have to give the powerful nations a self-interested way to frame their actions.
Okay, so let's say this all comes together. The summit happens, the deal is struck, the fund is created, the SDRs provide the capital. It sounds great in theory, but we know there are always sharks in the water. And step 5 deals with this directly, protecting the deal. Because as soon as a deal like this is announced, the vulture funds will start circling.
And for anyone listening who thinks that's just a colorful nickname, it's not. That is the actual term used in the financial industry, vulture funds.
It sounds like something out of a Bond movie. Who are these guys in real life?
They are highly specialized, very aggressive hedge funds. And their business model is, well, it's predatory. Here's how it works.
Lay it out for us.
They look for a country that is in deep financial trouble, say Zambia. They know a debt restructuring is coming. So they go onto the secondary market and they buy up Zambia's old bonds for pennies on the dollar. Maybe they paid 10 or 20 cents for a dollar of debt.
Okay, so they acquired the debt for incredibly cheap.
Right. Then, when the country finally manages to negotiate a restructuring deal with 95% of its other creditors, a deal like this African reset, where everyone agrees to take a haircut or convert their debt to equity,
The Vulture Fund says no.
the Vulture Fund refuses to participate. They hold out. And then they take the country to court, usually in London or New York, and they sue for the full face value of the bond 100 cents on the dollar-plus years of accrued interest.
They hold the entire country and the entire restructuring deal hostage.
Exactly. They weaponize the legal system. There was a famous case with Argentina where a vulture fund, run by a billionaire named Paul Singer, chased them around the world for 15 years. They even managed to get a court to order the seizure of an Argentine naval training ship that was docked in a port in Ghana.
You're kidding me.
I am not. This is how they operate. The source rightly says that we need legal armor against this kind of behavior because it only takes one or two successful lawsuits from vulture funds to make the entire reset collapse.
So how do you stop them? You can't just pass a resolution at the UN telling them to be nice.
No. You have to change the law in the only two places that matter for these contracts. The source is very specific. You need to pass new legislation in the United Kingdom and in New York State.
Why those two specific places?
Because for historical reasons, almost all international sovereign debt contracts are legally governed by either English law or New York law. If you pick up a bond that was issued by the government of Ghana and you read the fine print, it'll say, "This agreement shall be governed by and construed in accordance with the laws of the state of New York."
That is wild. A contract between Ghana and, say, a Chinese bank is governed by laws made in Albany, New York.
It is. It's a relic of financial history.
Uh-huh.
But what it means is that if the New York State legislature passes a simple law that says, in the event of a recognized comprehensive sovereign debt restructuring like the ASR, no creditor can sue for more than the amount offered in the restructuring deal, then the vulture funds are completely disarmed.
They have no court to go to.
Their legal avenue is shut down. It's a fascinating and slightly uncomfortable truth. A key component of securing African financial sovereignty actually depends on a legislative vote in Manhattan and London.
But there has to be a flip side to this. This is a two-way street. Step 6 is the governance reset inside Africa. Because I can hear the other side of the argument just as clearly. If you just wipe out $1 trillion of debt and pour in trillions more in investment, and the local governments are corrupt, what's to stop that money from just vanishing into private Swiss bank accounts?
And this is the essential quid pro quo. The source is very, very clear on this point. This is not a no-strings-attached deal. Bold relief from the outside requires bold reform on the inside.
What kind of reform are we talking about?
The source lists several conditions for any country to be eligible for the reset. Things like radical budget transparency, publicly accessible debt dashboards, and real enforceable anti-corruption measures.
And this is where the author's tech background comes roaring back in. He specifically mentions AI-powered procurement audits.
I absolutely love this detail because it moves the conversation from vague promises about fighting corruption into a concrete, verifiable mechanism.
Explain how that would work.
Okay, think about how a lot of government corruption happens. It's in procurement. The government issues a contract to build a new road. The contract goes to a company owned by the minister's cousin. And that company charges the state $5 million for a mile of road that should have cost $1 million.
The classic kickback scheme.
The classic scheme. The extra $4 million gets funneled back to the officials. Now imagine an agentic AI system. Remember the author wrote the book on this stuff? This AI is connected to the government's payment system. It sees every single invoice.
Okay.
But it also has real-time access to a global database of commodity prices. It knows the spot price for cement, for asphalt, for gravel, the average labor costs in that region.
So the $5 million invoice comes in.
And the AI instantly flags it. Alert! Invoice number 74B. Cost of materials quoted is 400% above the current market rate. And because the source proposes these reforms have to be public, that flag doesn't just go into some bureaucrat's inbox where it can be deleted.
It goes on a public dashboard for everyone to see.
Every dollar freed from debt service must be publicly traceable. You are using technology to create a level of transparency and accountability that makes the old models of corruption much, much harder to get away with. It's using AI to enforce the integrity that human systems have so often failed to provide.
So that is the core of the plan. You convert debt to equity through the African Future Fund. You capitalize it with reallocated SDRs framed as climate justice. You protect it from vultures with new laws in New York and London. And you police it with AI-driven transparency. That is a comprehensive plan.
It is.
But then the source throws in what it calls the most radical option of all, a sort of plan B, or maybe a plan Z.
The nuclear option, Section 6.
The African Monetary Union 2.0, the Pan-African digital settlement currency. This sounds like we are moving beyond the realm of financial reform and into straight-up revolution.
I think that's a fair description. This is the contingency plan. The source is basically saying, if the West and China refuse to play ball on the debt reset, if they continue to insist on the old broken model, then Africa needs to have a credible threat to go it alone.
So what's the problem this new currency is designed to solve?
The problem is dependency on the U.S. dollar. Right now, almost all international trade is settled in dollars. If Kenya wants to buy goods from Ghana, it's a surprisingly difficult transaction.
Because they don't want each other's currency.
Right. The Kenyan shilling and the Ghanaian cedi are not freely convertible. So what they do is the Kenyan importer first has to buy U.S. dollars with their shillings. They send the dollars to Ghana. The Ghanaian exporter then has to convert those dollars back into cedis.
So the U.S. dollar is the middleman for a purely African transaction.
For almost everything. Which means every country on the continent is in a constant, desperate scramble for dollars to facilitate trade and pay its debts. And it means that when the U.S. Federal Reserve raises interest rates in Washington, D.C., it causes economic pain in Nairobi and Accra.
They're importing American monetary policy.
Exactly. They have no monetary sovereignty. So the proposal is for a new continent-wide digital currency for settling trade. But, and this is the absolutely crucial part, it is not a fiat currency. It's not just backed by a government promise, like the dollar is.
What is it backed by?
It would be backed by a basket of real, tangible assets, commodities, Africa's immense mineral wealth, gold, copper, cobalt, platinum. Its energy output, both from oil and gas and increasingly from renewable sources like solar and hydro, and even future carbon credits.
So a resource-backed digital currency that feels both very old school, like the gold standard, and incredibly futuristic at the same time.
It is. It's a direct challenge to the entire post-Bretton Woods financial order, which is built on the fiat U.S. dollar. The source is arguing, Africa has the physical resources that the 21st century economy cannot function without. The world needs our cobalt for batteries, our platinum for green hydrogen. Why on earth are we pricing our own most valuable assets in someone else's paper currency?
If they actually did this, if they created a digital currency that was redeemable for the cobalt that powers every single iPhone and Tesla on the planet.
The global demand for that currency would be instantaneous and immense. If a company like Apple wants to secure its cobalt supply chain, it would first need to buy the African coin.
But the United States generally does not react well when other countries try to move away from using the dollar for major commodities.
It does not react well is the understatement of the century. That's why the source calls it the nuclear option. It would trigger a massive geopolitical confrontation. You would risk being cut off from the SWIFT banking system. You would face sanctions. But the argument is that if the debt trap is a slow-motion economic death, then the risk of a bold breakaway might be worth it. It's the ultimate path to true monetary sovereignty.
Okay, let's pull back from the brink of that nuclear option and look at the immediate political reality of 2026. Because you might be listening to all this and thinking, okay, this is a beautiful utopian plan on a blog, but there is no way the leaders of the G7 would ever agree to this.
The political inertia is huge.
But this is where Section 7 gets so interesting, because it discusses a very specific and very unlikely political figure, Italy's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni.
Right, the sidebar news snippets from the source are critical here. Now, Giorgia Meloni, as we know, comes from the political right. Her party, Brothers of Italy, has its roots in post-fascist movements. On paper, you would not expect her to be the great champion of African development and debt relief.
No, you'd expect her to be an inward-looking nationalist. Build the walls, close the borders, Italy first.
And she is definitely focused on borders. But look at what she's actually saying and doing, according to the source. She's boasting that in Italy, employment is at a record high and illegal immigration has decreased by 60%. She's claiming a major victory on the migration issue.
And what's her secret? How is she claiming to have done it?
The source says she is actively focusing on the continent's debt burden, offering repayment suspensions for climate events. She has her own initiative she calls the Mati Plan for Africa.
Wait, I need to process that. The hard-right nationalist leader of Italy is actively pursuing debt relief for African nations as her primary strategy to control migration.
Yes, because she seems to have realized a fundamental truth that many other European leaders have been slow to grasp. The source calls it the demographic investment strategy. She understands that you cannot build a wall high enough or a navy big enough to stop millions of desperate, unemployed young people with no future.
So the only real border security is prosperity in Africa.
This is not charity. It is preemptive global stabilization. That's a key quote. Meloni understands that Europe is an aging, shrinking continent. It needs stability on its southern flank. For Europe's own long-term survival, it needs a prosperous, stable Africa, not a collapsing one sending waves of migrants north. It's pure pragmatic self-interest.
There's also this interesting tension mentioned with the European Union. She has this famous quote, "I am Georgia, you will not take that away from me." And the source mentions she's breaking ranks with Brussels to speak directly to Russia about ending the war in Ukraine.
She is positioning herself as a sovereignist leader. She's saying, I don't care about the established protocols or what the bureaucrats in Brussels say the rules are. I, as the leader of Italy, have a problem migration, and I am going to solve it directly. And if that means talking to Putin or forgiving African debt, then that's what she'll do.
It's fascinating because it completely scrambles the traditional left versus right political divide on this issue.
It really does.
Yeah.
Traditionally, the left supports development aid and debt relief for humanitarian and moral reasons. The right opposes it and focuses on border security. This plan, the African Sovereign Reset, is a political unicorn because it achieves the goals of both.
How so?
It helps Africa develop, which satisfies the humanitarian goals of the left. And by creating jobs and opportunity in Africa, it reduces the pressure for migration, which satisfies the security goals of the right. It's a policy that Meloni can sell to her base.
So the political winds, in a very strange way, might actually be shifting to make a plan like this more plausible than it was 5 or 10 years ago.
Politics makes strange bedfellows. And in 2026, the strangest and most powerful bedfellows might just be a right-wing Italian prime minister and a futuristic blog post about African debt.
Okay, Section 8 provides a crucial historical sanity check because every time someone proposes large-scale debt cancellation, the immediate response is, that's unprecedented. It's a moral hazard. It's never been done.
That's it.
The source points to one of the powerful and ironic examples in modern history, Germany, 1953.
Yes. The London Debt Agreement. We should really tell this story.
Please do.
So the year is 1953. World War II has been over for 8 years. West Germany is a new democracy, but is an economic ruin. And it is completely drowning in debt. It has pre-war debt, post-war debt. It owes money to everyone. It simply cannot pay.
So what did the world do? Did they send in the IMF and demand austerity? Did they tell Germany, you started the war, you pay for it?
No. The Allies, the United States, the UK, France, the very countries Germany had just been trying to destroy, they all met in London.
Yeah.
And in the London Debt Agreement, they agreed to cancel about 50% of Germany's total debt. Just wrote it off. Gone.
Wiped slate clean.
And for the debt that remained, they did something even more radical. They linked Germany's repayment schedule to its ability to earn export revenue.
Meaning Germany only had to make debt payments if it was actually running a trade surplus.
Exactly. If the German economy was booming and they were selling lots of goods abroad, they paid. If they had a bad year, the payments were automatically reduced. They're essentially given the exact same kind of equity deal that this proposal is suggesting for Africa. The creditors bet on Germany's future success.
And the result of that deal was?
The Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle. Freed from the crushing burden of debt, West Germany went from a pile of rubble to the undisputed economic engine of Europe in less than 2 decades.
So the uncomfortable question the source poses is, why were we willing to do that for Germany, our former enemy who had just devastated the continent, but we have been unwilling to do it for Africa?
It's a deeply challenging question. The cold geopolitical answer is that in 1953, the West needed a strong, prosperous West Germany as a bulwark against the Soviet Union. It was strategic investment in our own security. The source is arguing that today we need a strong, prosperous Africa for the same reasons, as a bulwark against climate change, instability, and demographic collapse.
The source also contrasts this with the Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe, and the more recent HIPC initiative from the 2000s.
Right, the heavily indebted poor countries initiative. The source dismisses it as too small and too conditional. It was a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. It shaved off a little bit of interest here and there, but it never fundamentally changed the underlying dynamic of the debt trap. Africa never really got its Marshall Plan moment. It never got that massive one-time injection of capital to build a new foundation.
And when you look at the cost of this proposal, Section 8 breaks down the numbers. Because $2 to $3 trillion still sounds like an impossibly large sum of money.
Does it, though?
Yeah.
The source puts it in perspective. That entire amount is less than what the world spends on its militaries in one single year.
1 year.
We spend more than that every single year on new tanks, fighter jets, and missiles. The source also notes it's a tiny fraction of the total value of global financial assets. The money is there. The world is awash in capital that's desperately looking for a decent return. The argument is that investing that capital in the youngest, fastest growing population on Earth isn't a handout. It's the smartest growth investment you could possibly make.
And then there's the flip side of that cost, the cost of not doing it. The source calls it the alternative cost, permanent fragility in a continent of 1.4 billion people.
That's the part that keeps me up at night. If we think this plan is too expensive now, just imagine the cost later.
We'll pay it one way or another.
You'll pay it in endless humanitarian crises. You'll pay it in multi-billion-dollar peacekeeping missions. You'll pay it in supply chain chaos when key minerals don't get to market. You'll pay it in dealing with millions of climate refugees. The bill is coming due. This reset is just a proposal to pay it proactively and maybe even get a return on your investment.
Before we wrap up, I want to spend a moment on Section 9, on the author's worldview. Because as we said at the top, Paramendra Bhagat is a unique thinker. How does his very diverse background shape this very specific financial proposal?
Well, just look at the titles of his other works that are mentioned in the sidebar. You have deep tech stuff like the technologies behind agentic AI and liquid computing.
Right.
But then right next to that, you have Kalkism, the economic and spiritual blueprint, and political analysis like AOC 2028 and Trump's trade war.
He's all over the map, but in a really interesting way.
He's a synthesist. A traditional economist looks at a problem like this through a very narrow keyhole. They see interest rates, debt to GDP ratios, current account deficits. Bhagat is trying to look at the whole house. He sees the vital connection between the cutting-edge technology, the AI that can provide transparency, a deep spiritual or moral framework. The idea of a debt jubilee is an ancient religious concept, and the hard-nosed realities of geopolitics, the Meloni angle.
He also has a book titled Velocity Money, Crypto Karma,
which perfectly explains the digital currency part of the proposal. He clearly believes the old plumbing of the global financial system is obsolete. He sees money not just as a sterile accounting unit, but as a form of energy. It has velocity. It has karma. If you trap an entire continent in a cycle of unpayable debt, you're creating a massive blockage in the flow of global energy. If you release that debt, you unleash that energy. He's not just trying to fix a bug. He's trying to upgrade the entire operating system of the global economy.
So let's bring it all home. The final section, the outro. The headline of the proposal is simple and powerful. Cancel the debt. Convert the claims, invest in the future.
It's a very compelling slogan. It tells the whole story in 3 lines.
The vision here is that by 2050, historians could look back at the mid-2020s at this very moment, February 2026, as the great turning point.
The moment the world finally stopped just managing African debt, treating it like a chronic disease that you can only give palliative care for, and started actively financing African growth.
It's a very hopeful, very ambitious vision, but it leaves us with one final provocative thought. And I want to pose this to you and to everyone listening.
Go ahead.
If the developed world, if Europe, Japan, even China is aging and shrinking, if they are literally running out of young workers to power their economies and pay their pensions, and Africa's is the only continent left with a massive, young, dynamic workforce, who actually needs whom more in the long run?
That is the trillion-dollar question, isn't it? We frame this entire conversation as if we are doing Africa a favor. We talk about debt relief and aid. But in 20 or 30 years, when the global economy is desperate for new growth, desperate for labor, desperate for new consumers and new markets, we might just look back and realize that this African sovereign reset wasn't a bailout for Africa at all.
What was it then?
It was a survival strategy for the rest of us.
A survival strategy for the world. That is where we are going to leave it for today. A $1 trillion problem, a truly radical solution, and a demographic clock that is ticking louder every day.
It's definitely a lot to think about.
Let us know what you think. Is the African sovereign reset a utopian pipe dream, or is it the only pragmatic way forward? Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.